Hello, I'm Caroline Jones, and I'm here to share with you Chapter 22 from Jane of Lantern Hill. With the help of Cookery for Beginners, Mrs. Jimmy John's advice, and her own gumption, Jane learned to make pie crust surprisingly soon and surprisingly well. She did not mind asking Mrs. Jimmy John for advice, whereas she would have died before she would have asked Aunt Irene. Mrs. Jimmy John was a wise, serene creature with a face full of kindliness and wisdom. She had the reputation in Lantern Hill of never getting upset over anything, even church suppers. She did not laugh when Jane came over, white with despair because a cake had fallen or a lemon filling had run all over the plate and Dad had quirked a humorous eyebrow over it. In truth, Jane, for all her natural flair for cooking, would have made a good many muddles if it had not been for Mrs. Jimmy John. "I'd use a heaping tablespoon of cornstarch instead of a level one, Jane." "It says all measurements are level," said Jane doubtfully. "You can't always go by what the books say," said Step-a-Yard, who was as much interested in Jane's progress as anyone. "Just use gumption. Cooks are born, not made. I've always said, and you're a born one or I miss my guess. Them codfish balls you made the other day were the owl's whiskers." The day Jane achieved, unaided, a dinner of roast lamb with dressing, creamed peas, and a plum pudding that even Uncle Tombstone could have eaten, was the proudest day of her life. What bliss to have Dad pass his plate with, "A little more of the same, Jane. What matter the planetesimal hypothesis or the quantum theory compared to such a dinner? Come, Jane, don't tell me you're ignorant of the quantum theory. A woman may get by without knowing about the planetesimal hypothesis, but the quantum theory, Jane, is a necessity in any well-regulated household." Jane didn't mind when Dad ragged her. If she didn't know what the quantum theory was, she did know the plum pudding was good. She had got the recipe from Mrs. Big Donald. Jane was a great forager for recipes, and counted that day lost whose low-descending sun didn't see her copying a new one on the blank leaves at the back of Cookery for Beginners. Even Mrs. Snowbean contributed one for rice pudding. "Only kind we ever get," said young John. "It's cheap." Young John always came in for the scrapings. He had some sixth sense whereby he always knew when Jane was going to make a cake. The Snowbeams thought it was great fun when Jane named all her cooking utensils. The tea kettle that always danced on the stove when it was coming to a boil was Tipsy. The frying pan was Mr. Muffet. The dishpan was Polly, the stewpan was Timothy, the double boiler was Boodles, the rolling pin was Tilly Tid. But Jane met her Waterloo when she tried to make donuts. It sounded so easy, but even the Snowbeams couldn't eat the result. Jane, determined not to be defeated, tried again and again. Everybody took an interest in her tribulations over the donuts. Mrs. Jimmy John suggested, and Min's Ma gave hints. The storekeeper at the corner sent her a new brand of lard. Jane had begun by frying them in Timothy, then she tried Mr. Muffet. No use. The perverse donuts soaked fat every time. Jane woke up in the lone of the night and worried about it. "This won't do, my adored Jane," said Dad. "Don't you know that worry killed the widow's cat? Besides, people are telling me that you are old for your years. Just turn yourself into a wind song, my Jane, and think no more on donuts." In fact, Jane never did learn to make really good donuts, which kept her humble and prevented her showing off when Aunt Irene came. Aunt Irene came quite often. Sometimes she stayed all night. Jane hated to put her in the beloved guest room. Aunt Irene was always so delicately amused over Jane's having a guest room, and Aunt Irene thought it just too funny to find Jane splitting kindling. "Dad mostly does it, but he's been writing all day, and I wouldn't disturb him," said Jane. "Besides, I like to split kindling." "What a little philosopher it is," said Aunt Irene, trying to kiss her. Jane went crimson to the ears. "Please, Aunt Irene, I don't like to be kissed." "A nice thing to say to your own aunt, lovey," speaking volumes by an amused lift of her fair eyebrows. Smooth, smiling Aunt Irene would never get angry. Jane thought she might have liked her better after a good fight with her. She knew Dad was a little annoyed with her because she and Aunt Irene didn't click better, and that he thought it must be her fault. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was very naughty of her not to like Aunt Irene. Trying to patronize us, Jane thought indignantly. It was not so much what she said as the way she said it, as if you were just playing at being a housekeeper for Dad. Sometimes they went to town and had dinner with Aunt Irene. Gorgeous dinners, certainly. At first Jane writhed over them, but as the weeks went on, she began to feel she could hold her own even with Aunt Irene when it came to getting up a meal. "You're wonderful, lovey, but you have too much responsibility. I keep telling your father that." "I like responsibility," said Jane huffily. "Don't be so sensitive, lovey," as if it were a crime. If Jane couldn't learn to make donuts, she had no trouble learning to make jam. "I love making jam," she said when Dad asked her why she had bothered. Just to go into the pantry and look at shelf after shelf of ruby and amber jams and jellies gave her the deep satisfaction of a job well done. Morning after morning, she got up early to go raspberrying with Min or the Snowbeans. Later on, Lantern Hill reeked with the spicy smells of pickles. When Jenny Lister at the Corners was given a jam and pickle shower before her wedding, Jane went proudly with the others and took a basket full of jellies and pickles. She had great fun at the shower, for by this time she knew everybody and everybody knew her. A walk to the village was a joy. She could stop to chat now with everyone she met, and every dog would pass the time of day with her. Jane thought almost everybody was nice in a way. There were so many different kinds of niceness. She found no difficulty in talking to anybody on any subject. She liked to play with the young fry, but she liked to talk to the older people. She could hold the most enthralling discussions with Step-a-Yard on green feed and the price of pork and what made cows chew wood. She walked round Jimmy John's farm with him every Sunday morning and judged the crops. Uncle Tombstone taught her how to drive a horse and buggy. She could cramp a wheel after one showing, he told the Jimmy Johns. Step-a-Yard, not to be outdone, let her drive a load of hay into Jimmy John's big barn one day. Couldn't have done it better myself. You've got a feeling for horses, Jane. But Jane's favorite boyfriend was old Timothy Salt, who lived down near the harbor's mouth in a low-eaved house under dark spruces. He had the jolliest, shrewdest old face of wrinkled leather that Jane had ever seen, with deep-sunk eyes that were like wells of laughter. Jane would sit with him for hours while he opened quahogs and told her tales of old disaster on the sea, fading old legends of dune and headland, old romances of the North Shore that were like misty wraiths. Sometimes other old fishermen and sailors were there swapping yarns. Jane sat and listened and shooed Timothy's tame pig away when it came too near. The salt winds blew around her. The little waves on the harbor would run so fleetly from the sunset, and later on the fishing boats would be bobbing to the moon. Sometimes a ghostly white fog would come creeping up from the dunes. The hills across the harbor would be phantom hills in the mist, and even ugly things would be lovely and mysterious. "How's life with ye?" Timothy would say gravely, and Jane would tell him gravely, and Jane would tell him just as gravely that life was very well with her. Timothy gave her a glass box full of corals and seashells from the West and the East Indies. He helped her drag up flat stones from the shore to make paths in her garden. He taught her to saw and hammer in nails and swim. Jane swallowed most of the Atlantic Ocean learning to swim, or thought she did, but she learned and ran home a wet, delighted creature to brag to Dad. And she made a hammock out of barrel staves that was the talk of Lantern Hill. "That child will stick at nothing," said Mrs. Snowbeam. Timothy swung it between two of the spruces for her. Dad wasn't much good at doing things like that, though he told her he would do it if she would get him a rhyme for silver. Timothy taught her to discern the signs of the sky. Jane had never felt acquainted with the sky before. To stand on Lantern Hill and see the whole sky around you was wonderful. Jane could sit for hours at the roots of the spruces, gazing at sky and sea, or in some happy golden hollow among the dunes. She learned that a mackerel sky was a sign of the weather, of fine weather, and mare's tails meant wind. She learned that red sky at morning foretokened rain, as did the dark firs on Little Donald's hill when they looked so near and clear. Jane welcomed rain at Lantern Hill. She had never liked rain in the city, but here by the sea she loved it. She loved to listen to it coming down in the night on the ferns outside her window. She liked the sound and the scent and the freshness of it. She loved to get out in it, get sopping wet in it. She liked the showers that sometimes fell across the harbor, misty and purple, when it was quite fine on the Lantern Hill side. She even liked thunderstorms when they passed out to sea beyond the bar of the shadowy dunes and didn't come too close. But one night there was a terrible one. Blue swords of lightning stabbed the darkness. Thunder crackled all about Lantern Hill. Jane was crouching in her bed, her head buried in a pillow, when she felt Dad's arm go around her. He lifted her up and held her close to him, displacing an indignant pair of Peters. "Frightened, my Jane?" "No," lied Jane valiantly. "Only it isn't decent." Dad shouted with laughter. "You've got the word. Thunder like that is an insult to decency. But it will soon pass. It is passing now. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. Do you know where that is found, Jane?" "It sounds like the Bible," said Jane, as soon as she got her breath after a crash that must have split the hill in two. "I don't like the Bible." "Not like the Bible? Jane! Jane, this will never do. If anyone doesn't like the Bible, there's something wrong either with him or with the way he was introduced to it. We must do something about it. The Bible is a wonderful book, my Jane, full of corking good stories and the greatest poetry in the world, full of the most amazingly human nature, full of incredible, ageless wisdom and truth and beauty and common sense. Yes, we'll see about it. I think the worst of the storm is over, and tomorrow morning we'll hear the little waves whispering to each other again in the sunlight, and there'll be a magic of silver wings over the bar when the gulls go out. I shall begin the second canto of my epic on Methuselah's life, and Jane will swither in delightful anguish trying to decide whether to have breakfast indoors or out. And all the hills will be joyful together. More of the Bible, Jane. You'll love it." Perhaps so, though Jane thought it really would need a miracle. Anyhow, she loved Dad. Mother still shone on her life like a memory of the evening star. But Dad was Dad. Jane dropped asleep again and had a terrible dream that she couldn't find the onions and Dad's socks with the blue toes that needed mending.